So in 1985, Toril Moi published her seminal book of feminist theory and criticism, Textual Politics. And her introduction to that volume, interestingly enough, is titled Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Famous play, Feminist Readings of Woolf. Now, it's not her meatiest chapter in the book by far, but what's interesting about it is that it's a chapter written by a feminist defending a feminist from another feminist, right? So it's nice because it gives a clear, not a clear picture. It's a difficult chapter, but it introduces us, let's say, to the way in which the thing that I talked about at the beginning of the semester, that each of these approaches are really a sort of network of a network or a web or a whole field maybe of collaborative and competing ideas and concepts and urgencies even, right? And so you really see that at play in this article and in Moy's representation of Elaine Showalter's major feminist critic and theorist, still is, her critique of Woolf, right, and Woolf's feminism. Okay, so we get this interesting triangle in which Moy, who we might call a third wave feminist, defending Woolf, who, first second wave feminist, from Showalter, second wave feminist, right? So it's a nice dramatization anyway of the energies that can circulate within just this one approach. So according to Toril Moi, now I'm going to read, Elaine Showalter's criticisms of Virginia Woolf are very much a part of the second wave, and the potential limitations of some feminist literary criticism with, quote, often unconscious theoretical and political assumptions, end quote. So what does Showalter say about Woolf? Let's just read a few of the passages that Moi selects from Showalter's chapter on Woolf in A Literature of Their Own, published in 1977. So these are just some of the passages that Moi picks out and selects from Showalter's book. Okay, so quote. This is quoted on page 2 of Moy's article, or book chapter. Showalter. What is most striking about A Room of One's Own, textually and structurally, is its strenuous charm, its playfulness, its conversational surface. The techniques of room, or a room, are like those of Woolf's fiction, particularly Orlando, which she was writing at the same time: repetition, exaggeration, parody, whimsy, and multiple viewpoint. On the other hand, despite its illusions, not allusions, illusions of spontaneity and intimacy, A Room of One's Own is an extremely impersonal and defensive book. Quoted on page 3 of Moy's article, if one can see A Room of One's Own as a document in the literary history of female aestheticism and remain detached from its narrative strategies, the concepts of androgyny in the private room are neither as liberating nor as obvious as they first appear. They have a darker side that is the sphere of the exile and the eunuch, end quote. And then quoted on page 4, in 3 Guineas, a later text by Woolf, Woolf betrayed her own isolation from female mainstream. Many people were infuriated by the class assumptions in the book, as well as by its political naivete. More profoundly, however, Woolf was cut off from an understanding of the day-to-day life of women whom she wished to inspire. Characteristically, she rebelled against aspects of female experience that she had never personally known and avoided describing her own experience. Q.D. Leavis, in her scathing review of 3 Guineas in 1938, when it was first published, addressed herself to the question of female experience, making it clear that from her point of view, Woolf knew damn little about it. Goodness. So this is me now. Although we as a class have not read A Room of One's Own, or 3 Guineas, Showalter, though I'm happy to talk with anyone who wants to about them, Showalter does mention that the techniques and styles of these two works, though not novels per se, quote, are like those of her fiction, end quote. Which might prompt us to ask, what might an images of women critic think of Clarissa Dalloway? Or a critic who judges the representation of women with and against, remember what Parker calls and what Showalter calls in these passages, the actual experience of women, right? Do Showalter's comments make sense as a possible critique of Mrs. Dalloway as well, which we have read, obviously? Perhaps if we distance ourselves from Woolf's narrative strategies, as Showalter suggests, what do we see? A novel about a privileged, middle-aged, somewhat upper-class woman who does not seem to have any close friends, man or woman, who lives in an attic, like an exile, who is often associated with emotional and sexual coldness, like a eunuch, who does not seem plugged into the everyday experience of the woman in the flower shop, or the women she passes in the streets, or even the servants who are helping her prepare for her party later that night and for which she gets all the credit. What do we learn about women in this novel, the experience of women in this novel? According to this framework, practically nothing, it would seem. Indeed, it is clear that Mrs. Dalloway, as a narrative, wouldn't even pass the Bechdel test that I talk about in in an earlier video in this series. Or if it does pass the test, Miss Kilman, Doris Kilman, and Elizabeth Dalloway, Clarissa's daughter, sort of have a conversation with one another about something other than men near the end of the novel. But if that counts, right, if that makes the novel pass Bechdel's test, it does not really pass with flying colors. For a feminist criticism that aims to counterbalance the misrepresentation of women with accounts of actual experiences of women, or a feminist literary criticism that aims to recover texts that take women's experiences seriously, that despite being forgotten or suppressed, have somehow managed to survive in archives or on bottom shelves, Mrs. Dalloway might not exactly be the text one would want to put at the top of one's syllabus, or among texts that directly and critically challenge typical misrepresentations of women in cultural, literary, cinematic, or television narratives. It is here that we begin to make sense of what Parker describes in our textbook as, quote, prescriptive criticism, which presumptuously tells writers how to write, prescribing how they should write, rather than describing how they write, end quote. That's on page 153. We do see something like this in Moy's critique of Woolf, or at least, to be fair to Showalter, in Moy's representation of Showalter's critique of Woolf. Right? This is Moy, quote, page 4 of the book chapter. Showalter implicitly defines effective feminist writing as work that offers a powerful expression of personal experience in a social framework. According to this definition, Woolf's essays can't be very political either. Showalter's position on this point, in fact, strongly favors the form of writing commonly known as critical or bourgeois realism, precluding any real recognition of the value of Virginia Woolf's modernism, or we might say Virginia Woolf's experimental narrative. But Moy's critique extends beyond this association of Showalter with what Parker calls prescriptivism, right? A great deal beyond, in fact. In the paragraphs following this passage, Moy takes a long detour through the work of one George Lukács, a well-known Marxist critic, Hungarian critic, who was rather prescriptive in his own right about how novels should be written. And not because he was a jerk, but because he had a very robust theory of the social efficacy of narrative, and namely novels in particular. For him, the demonstration and communication of experience was also important. Not so much the experience of women, but rather, quote, man and society as a whole. Right, that's quoted on page 5. That's what novels are good for, according to Lukács. What Lukács liked about the great works of literary realism in the 19th century, and in some sense still being written in the 20th century too, is that they seemed to depict, quote, a three-dimensionality and all roundness, end quote, akin of society and of man, akin to the kind of representations and models of women's experience that Showalter and other critics of Woolf seem to want from her oeuvre. And precisely the sorts of representations the novel, because of its very form, right, and purpose, it would seem, and formal and stylistic, and maybe political purpose, the very sorts of representations the novel does not offer. Because of it, remember, its fragmentariness, its multi-perspectiveness, its ironic mode of narrative, the way in which it moves in and out of experience before we really get a full, fleshed-out sense of the lives, not only of the women, but even of the men in the novel, too. So what's the point of Moy's comparison between Lukács and Showalter? Let's take our time in the next video, moving through some pretty dense paragraphs of her book chapter, just so we become some pretty crystal clear on this, right? I'll come back and do that, keep this video shorter so I can go on and take my time working through those paragraphs, okay?